At the bottom of Lake Washington, in the cold and the dark, an entire forest is still standing. The trees have been underwater, upright, for more than 1,100 years, and they were all killed on the same afternoon by the same earthquake on a fault that runs directly beneath the city of Seattle. Everyone in this region has been taught to fear the offshore monster, the Cascadia big one waiting out under the ocean. Almost no one talks about the fault under their feet, the one that drowned that forest, lifted a shoreline 20 feet into the sky, and could, on its faster clock, be due again. Tonight we go down to where that fault waits, and ask why the real threat has been hiding in plain sight. One thing before we get into it: if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs, and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. Now let's break this down. Part 1. The fault nobody is watching. There is a fault that runs directly underneath the city of Seattle, not offshore, not 100 miles out to sea where the maps and the documentaries keep pointing. It runs under the stadiums, under the office towers, under the floating bridges and the ferry terminals and the neighborhoods where more than 3.5 million people in the greater metropolitan region sleep tonight. It crosses beneath downtown, slices under the south end of Lake Washington, and passes straight through Bainbridge Island on the far side of the water. Geologists call it the Seattle Fault, and for most of the last century almost no one outside a small circle of specialists even knew it was there. That is the strange thing about earthquake fear in the Pacific Northwest. Almost all of it is aimed in one direction, out at the ocean, at a monster everyone has a name for. And while the entire region stares at the horizon waiting for that one, the fault that could do the most damage to the most people sits quietly, patiently, directly beneath their feet. Here is the idea I want to walk you through tonight, and I want to be careful and honest with you about every piece of it, because this is a story where the truth is actually more unsettling than the exaggeration. The most famous earthquake threat in this part of the world is not the most dangerous one to the city of Seattle itself. The famous one is the Cascadia subduction zone, the offshore megathrust capable of a magnitude 9, the so-called big one. It is real. It is coming, on a geological clock, and when it arrives it will be one of the worst natural disasters in the history of North America. None of that is in dispute, and nothing I say tonight takes anything away from it. But the Seattle Fault is a different animal entirely. It is not a subduction zone far out under the sea floor. It is a shallow crack in the crust of the continent, a thrust fault, and it lies immediately below one of the fastest growing cities in the United States. When a fault that shallow breaks directly under a city, the rules change. The distance that normally softens an earthquake, the dozens or hundreds of kilometers of rock that absorb and scatter the energy before it ever reaches you, simply is not there. The break happens under the building, not under the ocean, and that single fact, proximity, is the whole reason a smaller earthquake on the Seattle Fault can be more dangerous to Seattle than a far larger one out at sea. That sounds like a contradiction, I know. A magnitude 9 is vastly more powerful than a magnitude 7. How could the smaller one possibly be worse? Stay with me, because the answer is the spine of everything that follows, and it is the reason this fault deserves a place in your mind right next to the famous one. We are going to look at what this fault has already done. Once, 1,100 years ago, when it lifted an entire shoreline more than 20 feet straight up out of the water in a single violent moment. We are going to look at brand new research from this year that suggests the network of hidden faults under Seattle may break more often than anyone realized, and that the official national hazard maps have been quietly undercounting them. And we're going to deal head-on with that loaded word, overdue, because the honest version of that word is not what the headlines want it to be, and the honest version is somehow more interesting. Let me give you a sense of just how invisible this fault was for most of modern history, because it tells you something about why the fear is pointed the wrong way. For the better part of the 20th century, the prevailing assumption was that the Puget Sound region faced a certain level of earthquake risk. But the Seattle Fault, as we now understand it, a shallow thrust fault capable of a magnitude 7.5 directly beneath downtown, was not clearly recognized as the major hazard it is until the late 1980s and into the 1990s. That is when a cluster of studies finally pieced together the evidence of a great prehistoric rupture. Sit with that timeline for a second. A fault that can produce a violent earthquake directly under one of the most important cities on the West Coast was not properly understood until a time when many of the people watching this right now were already alive. Much of the city, its older buildings, its highways, its bridges, was designed and built before anyone fully grasped what was sitting underneath it. And when I say the fault runs directly under the city, I want you to feel how literal that is. This is not a fault that passes politely through some empty stretch of countryside on the outskirts. Its strands cross beneath the most densely developed ground in the entire region, the kind of ground where hundreds of thousands of people work in towers stacked on top of one another, where elevated roadways carry rivers of traffic, where bridges float on the surface of a lake, where the port moves a significant share of the nation's trade. If you wanted to design the worst possible place to put a shallow, powerful fault, you would struggle to do better than running it directly beneath a crowded, vertical, interconnected modern city. That is precisely what nature has done here, and it did it long before the city existed. There is a particular kind of danger in a threat that is both enormous and quiet. A volcano that smokes and rumbles at least announces itself. A hurricane gives you days of warning as it crosses the ocean. But a locked fault does the opposite. The quieter it is, the more strain it is silently accumulating, and the closer it may be creeping toward release. The Seattle Fault has been almost perfectly quiet, in terms of great earthquakes, for more than 1,100 years. To many people, that silence reads as safety. To a geologist, that same silence can read as a fault patiently winding itself up. We will untangle which of those readings is correct, and the answer turns out to be more nuanced and more interesting than either the panic or the complacency would suggest. So before we go anywhere near the ocean, before we talk about the famous threat that everyone already fears, I want you to hold on to one image. A fault, running east to west, directly under the city, last awake more than 1,000 years ago. Why has almost everyone spent the last few decades looking the wrong way? That is where we begin. Part 2. Why everyone watches the wrong ocean. The reason almost everyone in the Pacific Northwest looks out to sea when they think about earthquakes is that, in the 1980s and 90s, scientists made one of the most dramatic discoveries in the history of American geology, and it rightly terrified people. They found that the offshore boundary running from Northern California up past Oregon and Washington and into British Columbia, a boundary called the Cascadia subduction zone, was not the quiet, harmless seam everyone had assumed. It was locked, loaded, and capable of producing an earthquake of magnitude 9, on par with the largest quakes ever recorded anywhere on the planet. To understand why that discovery swallowed all the attention, you have to understand what a subduction zone actually is. Off the coast, a slab of oceanic crust called the Juan de Fuca Plate is sliding, slowly and relentlessly, underneath the edge of the North American continent. It moves at roughly the speed your fingernails grow, a few centimeters a year, and for most of the time it does not slide smoothly. The two plates are stuck together along their contact, snagged, accumulating strain like a bent stick that refuses to break. When that contact finally lets go, it does not slip a little. It can rupture along hundreds of miles of coastline all at once, dropping and lifting the seafloor and unleashing a tsunami that crosses the entire Pacific Ocean. It helps to slow down on that image of the stuck plates, because it is the engine behind both of the threats in this story. Imagine pressing two enormous slabs of rough rock together, and then trying to slide one past or under the other. They do not glide, they catch, lock, and resist, while the force driving them never lets up. The rock bends, and stores that force the way a wooden ruler stores energy when you press its ends toward each other, flexing further and further while it holds. For decades, for centuries, the bend grows and nothing visible happens. And then, in an instant, the friction is overcome, the locked patch fails, and all that stored strain releases at once as the rock snaps back toward where it wanted to be. That snap is the earthquake. The longer the lock holds, the more strain accumulates, and the more violent the eventual release. This is why a fault that has been quiet for a very long time is not necessarily a safe fault. It may simply be a fault that has been bending its ruler for a very long time. We know Cascadia can do this because it already has. On a January night in the year 1700, the entire zone ruptured in a single magnitude 9 event. We know the date almost to the evening because the tsunami it sent racing across the ocean slammed into Japan about 10 hours later, and Japanese village records from that period carefully documented a mysterious wave that arrived with no earthquake felt beforehand, what they called an orphan tsunami. Match the Japanese timestamp to the drowned ghost forests along the Pacific Northwest coast, trees killed when the land suddenly dropped and seawater flooded their roots, and you can date the last great Cascadia earthquake with eerie precision. That is the famous threat. That is the one with the documentaries and the evacuation maps and the name. And here is where I want to be completely fair, because the point tonight is not that Cascadia is overrated. Cascadia is everything they say it is. When it goes, the shaking along the coast will last not for seconds, but for 4 or 5 minutes, an almost unimaginable duration, and the tsunami will give some coastal communities only 15 or 20 minutes to reach high ground. It is a generational catastrophe waiting to happen, and the people who study it and prepare for it are doing genuinely important work. But notice something about all of that. Notice where it happens. The Cascadia Megathrust is offshore. The rupture, the violent core of it, takes place out under the seafloor, tens of kilometers to more than 100 kilometers from downtown Seattle. The coast takes the worst of the shaking and almost all of the tsunami. Seattle, sitting well inland on the protected waters of Puget Sound, will absolutely feel a Cascadia 9. It will shake hard, and it will shake for a long, frightening time. But the city is not sitting on top of the rupture. It is a spectator to it, at a distance. It is worth pausing on just how completely the Cascadia discovery reshaped the public imagination, because that reshaping is part of why the closer threat slipped into the background. When scientists established that the offshore zone could produce a magnitude 9, it was genuinely revolutionary, and it deserved every bit of the attention it received. Whole fields of research, emergency planning, building code revision, tsunami evacuation mapping, and public education campaigns grew up around it. An entire regional culture of earthquake awareness formed, and almost all of it was oriented toward that one offshore source and the coastal communities most exposed to it. If you grew up in the Pacific Northwest in the last few decades, the big one you were taught to fear was Cascadia, and the picture in your head was almost certainly a coastal one, a wall of water, a drowned beach town, the ocean rearing up. That picture is accurate and it is important, but notice what it quietly does to a city like Seattle. It frames Seattle as a place that will feel the great earthquake from a distance, brace through several minutes of shaking, and then help the devastated coast recover. In that framing, Seattle is the relatively fortunate inland city, shielded by miles of land from the worst of the offshore rupture and the tsunami. And for Cascadia specifically, that framing is broadly correct. Seattle is not on the coast. It will not take the direct tsunami from an offshore megathrust the way the outer beaches will. But that very framing, the comforting idea of Seattle as the inland survivor, is exactly what makes the Seattle fault so easy to ignore. People absorb the lesson that the great danger is offshore and the city is at a safe remove from the rupture itself, and then they stopped there, never asking the obvious follow-up question. What if there were a fault that did not sit offshore? What if there were a rupture that happened not 100 miles out to sea, but in the rock directly beneath the downtown towers? The whole mental model of distance and safety that Cascadia taught everyone falls apart the moment the fault is underneath you instead of out at sea. And that distance is exactly the thing the famous threat has trained everyone to overlook. Because there is another fault, a far less famous one, where Seattle is not a spectator at all, where Seattle is sitting directly on top of the rupture. To understand why that matters so much, we have to talk about what distance actually does to an earthquake, and why being close to a smaller one can be so much worse than being far from a giant. Part 3. Why closer beats bigger. Let me put to rest the contradiction I raised at the start, because once you understand it, you cannot unsee it, and it reframes this entire region's risk. The question was this: a magnitude 9 is enormously more powerful than a magnitude 7, so how could a 7 on the Seattle fault possibly be more dangerous to Seattle than a 9 offshore? The answer comes down to the difference between two things people constantly confuse: the total energy an earthquake releases and the actual shaking that arrives at a particular spot on the ground. The total energy is governed by magnitude, and the magnitude scale is brutal in how it climbs. Each whole step up the scale represents roughly 32 times more energy released. So a magnitude 9 does not release a little more energy than a magnitude 7. It releases on the order of 1,000 times more. In raw total power, Cascadia is in a completely different league, and nothing about the Seattle fault changes that. But total energy released at the source is not what damages your house. What damages your house is the intensity of the ground motion that actually reaches it, and that intensity depends on three things working together: It depends on how much energy was released, yes, but it also depends on how far that energy had to travel to get to you, and on what kind of ground it passes through and arrives at along the way. Energy spreads out and weakens as it travels through rock. The farther the source, the more the shaking fades before it reaches the surface beneath your feet. This is why an earthquake can level one town and barely rattle another 50 miles away. Now apply that to our two faults. The Cascadia rupture happens offshore, with the city of Seattle sitting many tens of kilometers away across the intervening crust. By the time those seismic waves travel all that distance to downtown, they have spread, scattered, and weakened. They will still be strong, and the duration will be punishing, but the peak violence of the motion has been bled off by the journey. The Seattle fault is the opposite story in every way. It ruptures at shallow depth, only around 12 or 13 kilometers down, directly beneath the city. The energy has almost no distance to travel, and almost nothing to weaken it before it erupts straight up into the streets and the foundations. A smaller total release, delivered point blank, can produce more violent shaking in the city itself than a giant release delivered from far away. History has already shown us this principle in action in cities around the world, and the lesson is consistent and brutal. Some of the most destructive earthquakes in modern memory were not the largest by magnitude. They were moderate earthquakes that happened to rupture at shallow depth, directly beneath a populated place. A magnitude 6 or 7 that breaks a few kilometers under a city centre can flatten neighbourhoods and kill thousands, while a far larger magnitude 800s of kilometers away might do little more than rattle dishes and sway tall buildings. The difference is not the energy released at the source, it is where that energy is released relative to the people. A close, shallow, moderate earthquake concentrates its violence on the ground directly above it, and if that ground happens to hold a city, the result can be catastrophic out of all proportion to the magnitude number. This is the part of earthquake science that the headline magnitude figure consistently hides. We have trained ourselves to treat the magnitude as the whole story, to assume that a bigger number always means a worse disaster. But magnitude describes the earthquake. It does not describe your experience of the earthquake, which depends just as much on how close you are and what you're standing on. A modest earthquake in the wrong place beats a giant in the right place, every time, for the people in the wrong place. There is a way to picture this that makes it click. Imagine someone setting off a stick of dynamite a mile down the road from your house, and someone else lighting a single firecracker in the palm of their hand right next to your ear. The dynamite releases far more total energy, but it is the firecracker that leaves your ears ringing, because it went off right next to you. The Cascadia Megathrust is the dynamite down the road. The Seattle fault is the firecracker in the room. For the coast, Cascadia is the nightmare. For the city of Seattle specifically, the fault directly underneath may be the one that does the most concentrated harm per second of shaking. There is another dimension to closeness that the dynamite and firecracker image only hints at, and it has to do with the character of the shaking, not just its strength. When a fault ruptures directly beneath you, you do not get the gentle, rolling, back-and-forth swaying that a distant great earthquake sends through tall buildings far away. You get something sharper and more brutal, a violent jolting that includes strong vertical motion, the ground heaving up and down as well as side to side. Near a shallow rupture, the energy arrives in sudden, high-frequency pulses that are especially destructive to ordinary buildings, the kind of motion that snaps rigid walls and shears connections rather than gently rocking a skyscraper. The closer you are to the break, the more raw and the less softened that motion is, because it has not had distance to mellow into the long, slow waves that travel far. There is also the matter of how the rupture itself moves. A fault does not break everywhere at once. It tears along its length like a zipper, and if that tear happens to run toward a city, it can pile its energy up in the direction it is heading, the way the sound of a passing siren bunches up ahead of it. A rupture on the Seattle fault propagating toward the populated core could focus an extra pulse of energy directly into the city, a near-fault effect that has caused devastating, concentrated damage in other shallow earthquakes around the world. None of this applies to the distant offshore monster in the same way. These are the signatures of a close rupture, and they are part of why proximity is not a minor adjustment to the danger, but a transformation of it. And it gets worse because Seattle does not sit on solid bedrock. The city sits partly on top of a bowl of soft sediment, a sedimentary basin, and soft ground does something dangerous to seismic waves. It can trap them, slow them down, and amplify them, like the way a swimming pool sloshes and keeps sloshing long after you stop moving. We will come back to that basin later, because it turns a moderate earthquake into something nastier than its magnitude alone would predict. But hold the central point. The threat that matters most to this city is not the one that is biggest. It is the one that is closest. And the closest one has a track record. We know exactly what the Seattle Fault is capable of because a little over 1100 years ago on a winter night, it showed us. Part 4. The Winter the Ground Rose. In the winter of the year 923, into the early weeks of 924, the Seattle Fault broke. There was no one there to write it down in the way we would understand records today. The people of the Puget Sound region at that time left no written account, no instrument readings, no photographs. And yet we know this earthquake happened with remarkable confidence. We know roughly how big it was, and we can even narrow the date down to a single winter, because the land itself kept the record for us. The earthquake left scars across the region so distinct that geologists, more than 1,000 years later, could read them like the pages of a book. The clearest of those scars sits on the southeast tip of Bainbridge Island, at a place called Restoration Point, directly across the water from downtown Seattle. When the Seattle Fault ruptured that winter, the ground at Restoration Point did not just shake. It jumped. An entire piece of shoreline was thrust violently upward, lifted roughly 7 meters, more than 20 feet, straight up out of Puget Sound in a matter of seconds. Land that had been beach, land that had been underwater at high tide, was suddenly hoisted permanently above the reach of the sea, and it never came back down. Restoration Point still stands there today, more than 20 feet higher than it was the day before that earthquake, a literal platform of former seabed that you can walk across. It is one of the most remarkable pieces of evidence for a prehistoric earthquake anywhere in North America, and it is sitting in plain sight in the middle of a major American metro area. It was not the only place that rose. Across the water, at Alki Point in West Seattle, the land was lifted as well, by as much as 20 feet in places. When geologists in the early 1990s began carefully mapping these uplifted shorelines, they realized they were looking at the fingerprints of a single enormous event, a moment when the crust on the south side of the fault was shoved up and over the north side along a thrust, hoisting whole shorelines into the air at once. How big does an earthquake have to be to do that? The best modern estimate, built from detailed computer models that try to reproduce exactly the pattern of uplift we see preserved in the ground, points to a magnitude of about 7.5. The favoured model describes the fault breaking along an oblique reverse motion, with something like 15 metres of horizontal shortening, the crust on one side crumpling up and over the other, with the rupture reaching to a depth of around 12.5 kilometres. That is a magnitude 7.5 earthquake, at shallow depth, directly beneath what is now a city of millions. What I find most arresting about Restoration Point is that you can go and stand on it. This is not a buried abstraction accessible only to scientists with drilling rigs. It is a real place, on the southeast corner of Bainbridge Island, looking back across the water toward the Seattle skyline, and the ground you would stand on there is former seabed, hoisted into the daylight in a single convulsion 1100 years ago, and never lowered since. The old shoreline, the line the water used to reach, is now stranded well above the modern tide line, a fossil beach left high and dry by the earthquake. Geologists can walk that raised terrace and read in it the exact amount of uplift, because the sea leaves unmistakable marks at its edge, and those marks are now marooned in the air. The same is true at Alki Point across the water. These are not subtle features visible only to experts. They are large, permanent, and hiding in plain sight in a major metropolitan area, monuments to an earthquake that no human being witnessed, and yet that wrote itself indelibly into the shape of the land. Think about the strangeness of that for a moment. Millions of people live, work, and commute within sight of physical proof that the fault beneath them can throw a shoreline into the sky, and almost none of them know it is there or what it means. The evidence is not hidden in a journal. It is the ground itself, and it is precisely because the proof is so quiet, so easily mistaken for ordinary scenery, that the threat it represents stays out of mind. Now remember what we established about proximity. A 7.5 is not a Cascadia 9 in total energy, not even close. But a 7.5 rupturing at shallow depth directly under the urban core is exactly the firecracker in the room scenario, the close, violent, concentrated kind of shaking that does the most damage to the place sitting on top of it. And we are not speculating that it could happen. We are looking at the proof, frozen into the rock, that it already did. The same fault is still there. The same city now sits on top of it, except the city is no longer empty forest and tideland. It is glass towers, elevated highways, floating bridges, and millions of people. It is worth understanding the mechanics of how a fault lifts a shoreline 20 feet into the air, because it tells you what kind of beast the Seattle fault is. This is a reverse fault, also called a thrust fault, and it works by compression. The crust here is being squeezed, and along the Seattle fault the block of rock on the south side is being shoved up and over the block on the north side along an inclined fracture. For most of the time, friction holds the two blocks locked together while the squeezing continues, building strain. When the friction finally gives way, the south block lurches upward and outward in seconds, and anything sitting on it, including a stretch of beach with its barnacles and shellfish, is hoisted into the air and left there. That is why Restoration Point did not slowly rise over centuries. It jumped in a single moment by an amount taller than a two-story building. Imagine standing on that beach the instant it happened. The ground does not merely tremble, it heaves upward beneath you by something like the height of a small house, faster than you could react, and then the water that used to lap at your feet is suddenly far below you, draining away, because the land you're on has been permanently relocated upward out of the sea. That is the physical reality the rock recorded, and it was not confined to one point. The pattern of uplift, more here, less there, traced across multiple sites around the Sound, is precisely the data that let modern researchers reconstruct the earthquake. By feeding the measured uplift at each location into computer models and asking what size and geometry of rupture could produce exactly that pattern, they arrived at the magnitude 7.5 estimate. The oblique reverse motion, the roughly 15 meters of crustal shortening, the rupture reaching about 12.5 kilometers down. The shape of the land became a fingerprint, and the fingerprint pointed to a monster. Keep the central thread in view as we go, because it would be easy to treat this as ancient history, a curiosity from 1,000 years ago. It is not history in the sense of being over. It is a demonstration of a still-living fault's maximum behavior, preserved by accident, sitting in plain view in a modern metropolitan area. The fault that lifted Restoration Point is the same fault, in the same place, beneath the same city, and it has lost none of its capacity in the intervening centuries. The only thing that has changed is that the empty tideland of the 10th century is now covered in millions of people and the fragile machinery of a modern city. But the uplift was only the beginning of what that winter night did to the region, because when a fault throws the seafloor upward like that, the water has to go somewhere, and what the water did next is the part of this story that should genuinely make you sit up. Part 5. The Wave and the Drowned Forest. When the floor of Puget Sound lurched upward in the winter of 923, it shoved the water above it, and that displaced water did exactly what displaced water does. It became a tsunami. Not a Pacific-crossing, coast-destroying wave like the one a Cascadia rupture sends out to Japan, but something in some ways more frightening for the people who would live here later, a tsunami generated inside the enclosed waters of Puget Sound itself, with no warning and almost no travel time. The wave swept through the Sound and ran up onto the shorelines around what is now Seattle. Geologists have found the deposits it left behind, sheets of sand and marine sediment carried inland and dropped where only a tsunami could have put them. One of those deposits sits at the location of what is today the West Point area on the Seattle waterfront. The wave reached the city's own shore. Think about what that means in modern terms for a moment, and then I will pull us right back to the central thread, because this is the core of why the close fault is the dangerous one. A tsunami from Cascadia, far out at sea, is a horror, but it announces itself. The coast feels minutes of violent shaking first, and emergency planning is built around that warning window. Get to high ground in the 15 or 20 minutes you have. A tsunami born inside Puget Sound from the Seattle fault gives you almost nothing. The fault is right there. The shaking and the wave are nearly simultaneous. For shoreline communities ringing the Sound, the warning time could be measured not in minutes but in seconds. That is the difference proximity makes, expressed in water. The uplift and the tsunami were still not the whole of it. The shaking that winter was violent enough to tear the land apart in other ways, and the most haunting evidence of that sits at the bottom of Lake Washington, the large freshwater lake along Seattle's eastern edge. When the Seattle fault ruptured, the shaking triggered enormous landslides, and along the shores of Lake Washington, entire blocks of forested ground slid into the water. Whole stands of mature trees, still rooted, still upright, slid down beneath the surface and kept standing on the lake bed. They are still there. Divers and sonar surveys have found these drowned groves, sometimes called the sunken forests of Lake Washington, trees that have stood underwater, upright, for more than 1,100 years, killed in a single afternoon by a single earthquake. Some researchers think the landslides crashing into the lake may even have generated a second, separate tsunami within Lake Washington itself. Let me reconnect all of this to the one idea that holds the night together, because it would be easy to get lost in the spectacle of uplifted points and sunken trees and forget why they matter. Every one of these scars, the 20-foot lift at Restoration Point, the sand sheet at West Point, the standing forest on the floor of Lake Washington, is a record of what this specific fault, the one running under this specific city, did the last time it woke up. This is not a hypothetical. This is not a worst-case model dreamed up to scare people. This is the documented behavior of a fault that has not gone anywhere, beneath a city that has only grown more crowded and more fragile since. When people ask what the real threat to Seattle looks like, the honest answer is that it looks like the winter of 923 scaled up to a modern metropolis. Let me dwell on those sunken forests for a moment, because they are one of the most haunting pieces of physical evidence in all of North American geology, and most people have never heard of them. Picture a diver descending into the cold, dark water of Lake Washington, and finding, standing on the lake bed below, a grove of trees. Not fallen logs, standing trees, still rooted in the blocks of ground that slid out from the shore 1,100 years ago, preserved by the cold, low-oxygen water that slowed their decay to a crawl. These trees were alive in the year 923. They were growing on solid ground at the edge of the lake when the Seattle Fault ruptured. The shaking tore the hillside loose, and entire intact slabs of forest slid beneath the surface and simply kept standing where they came to rest. They have stood there in the dark ever since, silent markers of the exact instant the ground failed. When scientists dated the wood, it agreed with the uplifted shorelines and the tsunami deposits. Everything pointed to the same winter. Now think carefully about what a Puget Sound tsunami means for the modern city, because this is where the proximity argument becomes most vivid and most urgent. A tsunami is just displaced water finding its level again, and it does not care whether it was born in the open ocean or in an enclosed inland sea. When the floor of the Sound jumped upward in 923, the water above it was shoved aside and rolled outward toward the shores. In the open ocean Cascadia scenario, the saving grace, if you can call it that, is warning time, the minutes between the shaking and the wave. But the Seattle Fault is not offshore. It is right here, beneath the Sound and the city. The shaking and the wave would arrive almost together. The same closeness that makes the shaking so violent also strips away the warning time for the water. For people on the crowded shorelines of the Sound, the ferry docks, the waterfront parks, the low industrial flats, a locally generated tsunami could arrive while the ground was still moving. Tie this back to the thread before we move on, because the spectacle can distract from the argument. The drowned forest, the sand sheet at West Point, the wave in the Sound are not just eerie trivia. They are the signature of a close fault doing close fault things, delivering not only violent shaking but a near-instant local tsunami to a place that has no distance to protect it. This is what makes the Seattle Fault categorically different from the offshore monster everyone watches. It is not that it is bigger. It is that it is here, and here means no warning, no buffer, no distance. So the natural question, the one that should be forming in your mind right now, is the obvious one. If the fault did this once, when will it do it again? And here is where the story takes a turn that most coverage gets badly wrong, because to answer that question honestly, we first have to understand how anyone can possibly read the age of an earthquake out of dirt and trees in the first place. Part 6. Reading the Scars. The obvious objection to everything I've just told you is a fair one. How could anyone possibly know that an earthquake happened in the winter of 923, more than 1,000 years before anyone was taking seismic measurements in this region? It sounds almost too precise to be real, and the answer is one of the quiet triumphs of modern earth science, because geologists have learned to date prehistoric earthquakes from 3 independent kinds of evidence that, when they all agree, leave very little room for doubt. The first method is the uplifted shorelines themselves. When Restoration Point and Alki Point were thrust upward, they carried with them living things, shellfish, barnacles, marsh plants that had been growing right at sea level. The moment they were lifted into the air, those organisms died. By collecting their remains and running radiocarbon dating, measuring how much of a particular radioactive form of carbon has decayed since the organism stopped living, scientists can pin down roughly when that sudden lift happened. Across multiple sites around Puget Sound, the radiocarbon dates clustered tightly around the same window, the early 10th century, telling researchers that all these places rose at the same time in one event. The second method is even more elegant, and it comes from trees. Some of the trees killed in the earthquake, including those drowned in Lake Washington and others killed by the sudden flooding of low ground, were preserved well enough that scientists could study their growth rings. Tree rings record 1 year of growth apiece, and the patterns of wide and narrow rings can be matched against long master chronologies built from many trees across a region. This technique, dendrochronology, can sometimes date the death of a tree not just to a year but to a season, whether the tree died during the growing part of the year or during winter dormancy. The trees killed by the Seattle Fault earthquake pointed to death in the winter. Combined with cosmogenic and radiocarbon work, more recent studies have narrowed the event to that single winter of 923 into 924. There is a further line of evidence worth mentioning, because it shows how many independent ways the same event left its mark. Around the shores of Puget Sound, in salt marshes and tidal flats, geologists have found buried layers that record sudden changes in the relationship between land and sea. When an earthquake abruptly raises or lowers the land, it can bury a living marsh surface under a sheet of sand or mud, or expose a former tidal flat, and these abrupt transitions get preserved in the layered sediment as a sharp, datable boundary rather than a gradual one. A slow, natural change in sea level leaves a smeared gradual signature. An earthquake leaves a knife edge. Finding those knife edge boundaries at the right depth and dating the material right at the contact gives yet another independent confirmation of a sudden tectonic event in the early 10th century. The marshes themselves kept a record. When you stack all of these lines of evidence together, the uplifted and stranded shorelines, the radiocarbon dates on the killed organisms, the winter-dated tree rings, the buried marsh surfaces, and the offset layers in trenches, you're not looking at a guess or a single shaky measurement. You're looking at a convergence so thorough that the event is essentially as well established as anything in prehistory can be. That robustness is exactly what licenses the confidence with which scientists treat the Seattle Fault as a live and serious hazard, and it is why the harder, scarier questions about frequency rest on solid ground rather than speculation. The third method is trenching, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Geologists dig long, careful trenches directly across the trace of a fault and then read the exposed walls like a sliced layer cake. Each layer of soil represents a period of time, and when a fault ruptures, it offsets those layers, shoving them up or sideways and sometimes burying old soil under landslide debris or beach sand. By dating the material in the disturbed layers, researchers can identify individual past earthquakes and estimate when each one happened. Trenching across the Seattle Fault and its relatives confirmed the great rupture of the early 10th century, and began to hint at the harder question that the rest of tonight turns on, the question of how often. What makes this detective work so convincing is that these three methods are completely independent of one another, and yet they agree. Radiocarbon dating relies on the physics of decaying atoms in dead shellfish and plants. Tree ring dating relies on the biology of annual growth in wood. Trenching relies on the layering of soil and the geometry of how a fault offsets it. There is no reason these three different clocks, built on three different natural processes, should happen to agree on a wrong answer. When all three point to the same narrow window in the early 10th century, the conclusion becomes very hard to argue with. It is the convergence of independent evidence that turns a guess into knowledge. The tree ring evidence in particular deserves a closer look, because it is almost unreasonably precise. Trees lay down a distinct ring each year, wider in good years, narrower in lean ones, and because every tree in a region experiences the same sequence of good and lean years, their ring patterns can be matched against one another and against long master records that stretch back many centuries. When a tree dies suddenly, its outermost ring marks the year of its death, and the state of that final ring, whether it is a complete season's growth or only a partial one, can even reveal the time of year. The trees killed by the Seattle Fault earthquake pointed not just to a year, but to the dormant season, the winter. That is how researchers can speak about the winter of 923 with such confidence. A tree that died standing in cold water more than 1,000 years ago essentially wrote down the season of its own death, and we have learned to read it. There is a larger point hiding in all of this, and it bears on how seriously to take the threat. The reason scientists can describe a prehistoric earthquake in such detail is the same reason they can be confident the fault is genuinely dangerous. They are not extrapolating from a vague hunch. They are reading a detailed, multiply-confirmed physical record left by the fault itself. So when those same methods are turned toward the harder question of frequency, of how often this fault and its relatives rupture, the answers they produce carry real weight. They are built on the same rigorous foundation as the date of the last great quake. Pull this back to the thread for a moment, because the methods are not just trivia, they are the foundation of the whole argument. Everything we're about to say about whether this fault is overdue, about whether the official maps are undercounting the danger, rests entirely on this ability to read the buried record. We trust that the Seattle fault is dangerous not because someone felt a hunch, but because the uplifted shellfish, the winter-killed tree rings, and the offset trench layers all tell the same story. And that same buried record holds the answer to the question everyone actually wants answered, not what the fault did, but when it is likely to do it again, and whether the word everyone keeps reaching for, overdue, is even the right word at all. The honest answer is going to surprise you, and it is where most of the fear gets the science wrong. Part 7. The truth about the word overdue. Here is where I have to slow down and be very careful with you, because this is the exact point where the internet, the headlines, and well-meaning but sloppy storytelling go off the rails. You have probably heard, maybe even tonight from the way this video is titled, that the Seattle fault is overdue. It is a powerful word. It makes the danger feel scheduled, imminent, like a train pulling into a station. And the honest truth is more complicated than that word allows, but stay with me. Because the honest truth does not make the fault less frightening. It just makes it frightening in a smarter, more accurate way. When people say a fault is overdue, they are leaning on an idea called the recurrence interval, the average amount of time between major earthquakes on a given fault. If a fault tends to produce a big quake every 500 years, and it has been 600 years since the last one, you might reasonably call it overdue. So the obvious move is to take the Seattle fault, note that its last great rupture was about 1100 years ago, and declare it overdue. But that move depends entirely on a number most people never ask for. Overdue compared to what recurrence interval? And this is where the real science delivers a genuine plot twist. For the very largest earthquakes the Seattle fault can produce, the magnitude 7.5 class event like the one in 923, the recurrence interval is not 500 years. It appears to be enormous. When researchers look at the full geologic record stretching back roughly 11,000 years, they find that the Great 923 earthquake appears to be the only event of magnitude 7.5 or larger in all that time. 1 in 11,000 years. That implies the recurrence interval for the biggest Seattle fault earthquakes is probably not shorter than about 5,000 years. Read that again. For the maximum event, the 20-foot uplift monster, we're only about 1,100 years into a cycle that may run 5,000 years or more. By that measure, the big one on the Seattle fault is not overdue at all. We may have thousands of years of buffer before the next one of that exact size. Now, if I stopped there, you would be forgiven for feeling relieved and clicking away. But that would be the wrong lesson, because the maximum event is not the only event this fault can produce, and it is not even the one you should be most concerned about. Because while the giant 7.5 may come along only once every several thousand years, the evidence points to something else happening far more frequently. The Seattle fault appears to have been active 3 to 4 times in just the past 3,000 years, producing earthquakes of roughly magnitude 6.5 or greater, on a recurrence closer to once every 1,000 years, and on that clock, with the last major rupture about 1,100 years ago, we are not early. We are right in the window. It is important to be honest about the uncertainty in these recurrence numbers too, because they are estimates, not guarantees, and the honest version of this story does not pretend otherwise. When researchers say the largest events recur on the order of every 5,000 years, and the moderate ones roughly every 1,000, they are reading a sparse and ancient record, a handful of events smeared across thousands of years of geology, and the error bars are wide. The real intervals could be somewhat shorter or somewhat longer. But notice that this uncertainty cuts both ways and is not a reason for comfort. If anything, The surprises in recent research have tended to push the frequency of moderate events upward, not downward, suggesting the ground breaks more often than the older estimates assumed. There is a subtler trap hiding in the word average, and it is worth dismantling. When we say a fault produces a moderate quake on average every 1,000 years, people instinctively imagine a metronome, a steady beat, one quake precisely each millennium, so that being 1,100 years out means we are 100 years past due, as if the earthquake were a train running slightly late. Faults do not work like trains. The intervals between earthquakes are irregular and clustered, sometimes shorter, sometimes much longer, scattered around the average rather than marching to it. A fault can stay quiet for well beyond its average interval and then break, or it can break earlier than expected. The average tells you the long-run rate, the odds per century, but it does not promise a schedule. So 1,100 years past the last moderate rupture does not mean the next one is mathematically due this decade. It means the fault is well within the range where the next one becomes a live possibility on a human timescale, which is a statement about probability, not about timing. That is exactly why forecasting, not prediction, is the only honest game in town, a point we will come back to. So here is the honest, careful version of Overdue, and it is the version I want you to carry out of this video. The maximum, civilization-scarring 20-foot uplift magnitude 7.5 is not overdue. There is likely a long buffer before that specific monster returns. But a magnitude 6.5 class earthquake directly beneath the city, on a fault that recurs at that size roughly every 1,000 years, with 1,100 years already elapsed, is entirely plausible on a human timescale. And do not let the smaller number fool you into comfort. A magnitude 6.5 is not gentle. Remember everything we said about proximity and shallow depth, and the soft basin under the city. A 6.5 rupturing directly under downtown Seattle is, by the standard scenarios, a genuine disaster, capable of collapsing vulnerable buildings, severing bridges and pipelines, and killing people. It is the most likely version of the real threat, and it is the one the word overdue actually applies to. I want to make sure this distinction really lands, because it is the single most misunderstood thing about the Seattle fault, and getting it right is the difference between useful fear and useless fear. Picture two different clocks ticking inside the same fault. One clock counts down the giant, the magnitude 7.5, and that clock runs extraordinarily slowly, on the order of once every several thousand years. We are about 1,100 years into it. On that clock we are early. There is very likely a long stretch of time before the maximum event returns, and anyone telling you the big one on the Seattle fault is imminent is, frankly, not being faithful to the data. But the second clock counts down the moderate but devastating earthquake, the magnitude 6.5 class, and that clock runs far faster, on the order of once every 1,000 years or so, with the evidence suggesting 3 to 4 such events in the last 3,000 years. We are about 1,100 years past the last major rupture. On that clock, we are not early at all. We are squarely in the window where the next one becomes plausible on a timescale that matters to people alive today, to their children, to the buildings going up in the city right now. 2 clocks, same fault, wildly different readings. The headlines collapse them into a single misleading word. The honest science keeps them separate, and here is the part that should keep the moderate clock from feeling like good news. A magnitude 6.5 is not a near miss. It is not a tremor you sleep through. Remember everything we established about proximity, shallow depth, and the soft basin beneath the city. A 6.5 rupturing directly under downtown, amplified by the sediment, delivering its violence point blank, is, by the formal scenarios that planners actually use, a major urban disaster. It is the kind of earthquake that collapses older buildings, drops bridges, ruptures the pipes that carry water and gas, and kills people. The smaller number does not mean a smaller catastrophe for the city. It means a catastrophe that is closer on the clock. That is the version of the threat that the word overdue genuinely fits, and it is precisely the version most people have never had explained to them. This is why I keep coming back to the central idea. The danger to Seattle was never really about the absolute biggest number. It was about the close fault, the frequent fault, the one sitting under the city on a clock that has, for the moderate but devastating event, plausibly already run out. And as if that were not enough, brand new research from this very year suggests that even this picture may be too optimistic, because the faults under Seattle may be more numerous and more active than the official maps have ever admitted. Part 8. the faults we never mapped. Everything I have told you so far is built on decades of careful work, but science does not stand still, and in 2026 new research has been sharpening and in some ways darkening the picture beneath Seattle. The headline finding is unsettling in a very specific way. It is not that the Seattle fault is bigger than we thought. It is that there appear to be more faults down there than the official hazard models account for, and that some of them may rupture more often than anyone had assumed. To understand why this matters, you have to know how earthquake hazard maps actually get made. When agencies build the National Seismic Hazard Model, the master map that informs building codes and insurance and emergency planning, they include the faults they know well, the ones that have been thoroughly studied and characterized. But a fault that is hidden, buried under sediment and water, and a century of urban development that has not been fully mapped or dated, may not make it into the model at all, or may be included only in a limited way. And that means the official hazard estimate for a place can be, in effect, missing pieces. The map can say the danger is one thing while the actual ground hides faults capable of making it worse. The new research points exactly at this gap. Studies this year indicate that there is a network of shallow faults beneath the Seattle area, secondary strands related to the main Seattle fault that may rupture more frequently than previously recognized, and that are not fully represented in the national hazard modeling. In plain language, there may be more ways for the ground under Seattle to break, and those breaks may come more often than the standard maps tell you. The hazard, in other words, has been quietly underestimated, not through any conspiracy, but simply because the science is still catching up to what is actually down there. And there is a second finding from this year that is, if anything, more sobering. Research has suggested that two separate faults in the Seattle area may have ruptured at about the same time in the geologic past. Sit with the implication of that for a moment. If two faults can let go together, or in close succession, then the relevant scenario is not necessarily one fault producing one earthquake. It is the possibility of a compound rupture, multiple faults breaking in a linked event, which could extend the area of severe shaking, lengthen the duration, and broaden the footprint of damage well beyond what any single fault model predicts. The threat may not be a line on a map. It may be a system capable of acting in concert. Let me be careful and honest here too, the way the science demands and the way this channel always tries to be. The fact that hidden faults exist and may rupture more often does not mean an earthquake is imminent tomorrow. It does not let anyone predict a date. What it does is widen the range of realistic bad days and raise the baseline level of concern. It means the gap between the official map and the real ground is a gap on the dangerous side, not the safe side. When the surprises in the data keep pointing toward more hazard rather than less, that is exactly the situation in which a rational person pays closer attention. To feel the weight of this, you have to understand what a hazard map actually does in the real world, because it is not just an academic exercise. The National Seismic Hazard Model is the document that quietly shapes how strong your building has to be, how much your earthquake insurance costs, where hospitals and schools are required to be reinforced, and how a city plans its emergency response. It translates the science of faults into the rules of construction. So when a fault, or a whole set of secondary faults, is missing or underrepresented in that model, the consequence is not abstract. It means buildings may be engineered to a standard that assumes less shaking than the ground can actually deliver. It means the official odds posted for a neighborhood may be too low. The map is the interface between what the Earth can do and what we build to withstand, and a gap in the map is a gap in our defenses. This is why the 2026 findings are more than an academic update. If hidden strands beneath Seattle rupture more often than the model assumes, then the real shaking hazard for parts of the city is higher than the official numbers say, and has been for as long as those numbers have guided construction. It does not mean every building is doomed. It means the margin of safety some structures were designed with may be thinner than anyone intended, because the design was based on an incomplete picture of what lies beneath. The good news, and it is real good news, is that this is exactly the kind of finding that, once published, can be folded into future codes and retrofitting priorities. The danger is being made visible. But for the city that already exists built on the old assumptions, the discovery is a sobering one. It is worth understanding why a fault can stay hidden beneath a major city in the first place, because it sounds absurd that we could miss something so important right under our feet. The reason is that faults are easiest to find when they leave a clear scar at the surface, a visible offset in the ground that geologists can map and trench. But many of the faults beneath the Puget lowland do not break cleanly to the surface. They are blind faults, buried under thick layers of sediment, glacial deposits, water, and a century or more of urban development that has paved, graded, and built over whatever subtle clues might once have shown. A fault hidden under downtown buildings and beneath the floor of the Sound does not announce itself on a geologic map. It has to be hunted with indirect tools, seismic imaging that bounces waves off buried structures, careful analysis of small earthquakes, measurements of how the ground is slowly deforming. Those tools have improved dramatically in recent years, which is exactly why the picture keeps changing. That is the larger meaning of the 2026 findings. They are not telling us that the faults suddenly appeared. The faults were always there. What changed is our ability to see them, and as our vision sharpens, the hidden network beneath the city is resolving into something more crowded and more active than the older, blurrier picture suggested. Every improvement in the technology tends to reveal more structure, not less, which is a quiet warning in itself. The danger we can measure is almost certainly a floor, not a ceiling, and the possibility of compound rupture sharpens it further. A single fault breaking produces one earthquake with one footprint of severe shaking. But if two or more faults can let go together, or one can trigger the next, the area of intense shaking widens and the duration lengthens. Longer shaking is not a minor detail. The length of time the ground moves is one of the biggest factors in whether a building survives or fails, because damage accumulates with every additional second of cyclic stress on a structure already weakened by the first jolts. A compound rupture across the Puget lowland faults could therefore be worse, not in some simple additive way, but disproportionately, hammering buildings for longer over a broader area than any single fault scenario would suggest. That is the kind of low-probability, high-consequence event that the new research has nudged from unthinkable toward merely unlikely, which is a meaningful and unwelcome move. And this connects straight back to the thread that runs through everything tonight. The reason this matters is not abstract. It is that all of these faults, the main Seattle fault and its hidden relatives, sit directly underneath the city in that worst possible position where proximity turns even a moderate rupture into a close-range blow. The new research is not telling us the famous offshore monster got worse. It is telling us the quiet danger under our feet is larger and busier than the maps admit, which raises a question we have touched on but not yet truly opened. Why would the same magnitude of earthquake hit Seattle so much harder than it would hit a city built on harder ground? The answer is buried in the dirt the city is built on, and it is the reason a moderate quake here could behave like a monster. Part 9. The Bowl Beneath the City. Seattle has a geological problem that most people who live there have never thought about, and it has nothing to do with the fault itself and everything to do with what the fault's energy runs into on its way to the surface. The city does not sit on a uniform slab of hard bedrock. A large part of it sits over a basin, a thick bowl of softer sediment, sand, gravel, clay, and fill that has accumulated over geological time. And soft sediment does something to earthquake waves that hard rock does not. It amplifies them. To understand why, picture the difference between shaking a bowl of solid concrete and shaking a bowl of jelly. Strike the concrete and the motion passes through quickly and fades. Strike the bowl of jelly and it wobbles and keeps wobbling, the motion trapped and bouncing around inside the soft material long after the initial jolt. A sedimentary basin behaves like that bowl of jelly on a city-wide scale. When seismic waves enter the basin, they slow down, and because energy has to be conserved as the waves slow, their amplitude grows. The waves can also become trapped inside the basin, reflecting off its edges and its floor so that the shaking is not only stronger but lasts longer than it would on solid ground nearby. Geologists call this basin amplification, and it is one of the reasons two neighborhoods only a few miles apart can experience wildly different levels of destruction in the same earthquake. There is a second related danger lurking in that soft ground, and it is called liquefaction. When loose, water-saturated soil, the kind found in filled land along waterfronts and old tidal flats, is shaken hard enough, it can temporarily lose its strength and behave like a liquid. Solid ground turns, for a terrible few moments, into something closer to quicksand. Buildings can tilt, sink, or topple. Roads can buckle. Underground pipes can float upward and rupture. Much of Seattle's industrial waterfront, its port, and some of its most built-up low-lying areas sit on exactly the kind of artificial fill and soft sediment most prone to liquefaction. In the 1923 event, the ground failures were written across the region in landslides and slumping. In a modern repeat, those same processes would be tearing at foundations, pipelines, and transportation links. The Seattle Basin is not a small feature either. It is a thick wedge of sediment filling a structural low in the bedrock, and in places it runs several kilometers thick beneath the surface of the city. The Seattle Fault itself helped create the conditions for this basin over geological time, which produces a grim irony. The same tectonic squeezing that built the fault also helped build the soft bowl that will amplify the fault's shaking. When seismic waves from a rupture enter that wedge of sediment, especially from a source as close as the fault directly beneath it, they can be focused and trapped in ways that produce localized pockets of unusually intense, unusually prolonged motion. Two buildings of identical construction, a few miles apart, can have very different fates depending on exactly where they sit relative to the basin's geometry. The ground itself becomes an active participant in the disaster, not a passive stage. There is a particularly cruel wrinkle to basin amplification involving the rhythm of the shaking, and it is worth understanding because it determines which buildings suffer most. Every structure has a natural frequency at which it likes to sway, and tall buildings sway slowly while short ones sway quickly. A soft, thick basin tends to amplify the slower, longer period waves especially strongly. When the rhythm of the amplified ground motion happens to match the natural sway of a building, the two can fall into a kind of resonance, the same physics by which a child on a swing goes higher and higher when pushed in time. The building drinks in the energy and its motion grows, oscillation after oscillation, until the structure is stressed far beyond what the raw shaking alone would suggest. This is why, in basin-affected cities, certain classes of buildings of a particular height can be devastated while their neighbours of a different height come through. The basin does not just amplify the shaking, it can tune it, selecting victims by their architecture. For a city like Seattle, with its mix of building heights stacked across a thick sedimentary basin, this means the damage in a Seattle fault rupture would not be uniform or predictable in a simple way. It would be patchy, concentrated, and in places counterintuitive, with the worst destruction sometimes falling not where the shaking was nominally strongest, but where the ground's rhythm matched the building's own. It is one more reason a moderate earthquake here cannot be judged by its magnitude alone, because the ground and the buildings will be having a complicated and dangerous conversation that the magnitude number knows nothing about. Liquefaction deserves a closer look too, because it is one of the most counterintuitive and destructive things an earthquake can do. Loose water-saturated sediment gets its strength from the friction between its grains, the way slightly damp sand can hold the shape of a sandcastle. But shake that sediment hard enough and the water pressure between the grains spikes. The grains lose contact with one another, and the whole mass briefly behaves like a dense liquid. Anything resting on it, a building, a road, a buried pipe, suddenly has nothing solid to rest on. Heavy structures can sink or tip. Buried tanks and pipelines, being lighter than the liquefied soil around them, can actually float upward and tear apart. And much of Seattle's most economically vital ground, the port facilities, the industrial district, the filled land along the waterfront, sits on exactly the kind of young, loose, saturated material that is most prone to this. These are not the hills of solid glacial till. These are the made lands and the rivermouth flats, and in a close, strong earthquake, they are the most treacherous ground in the city. Bring this back to the central thread, because the basin is the multiplier that makes the close faults so much worse. We already said that a shallow rupture directly under the city delivers more violent shaking than a distant giant. Now add the basin. Take that close, sharp jolt and pour it into a bowl of soft sediment that amplifies it and makes it ring. A magnitude 6.5 on the Seattle Fault does not arrive at the surface as a tidy textbook 6.5. In parts of the city, the soft ground can make it feel and behave like something considerably worse, concentrated, prolonged, and locally amplified right where the most people and the most fragile infrastructure happen to be. The fault is the trigger. The basin is the amplifier. Together, they are the reason proximity is not just a small disadvantage for Seattle, but a profound one. And the Seattle Fault is not even acting alone, because it is only one member of a whole family of faults threaded through the region. Part 10. A system, not a single line. It would be comforting to think of the Seattle Fault as a single, lonely crack that we can name, map, and keep an eye on. But the truth is that it is one strand in a broader network of shallow faults running through the lowland that cradles Puget Sound. Geologists refer to this region as the Puget Lowland, and it is laced with crustal faults, several of which are capable of producing major earthquakes in their own right. The Seattle Fault is the most famous of them because it runs directly under the larger city, but it has siblings, and they matter to the story. To the south runs the Tacoma Fault, another shallow crustal fault capable of significant earthquakes beneath the Tacoma area and the southern Puget Sound communities. Farther north lies the South Whidbey Island Fault, a lengthy fault zone running through the northern part of the region. There are others, some well studied, some only partly mapped, some likely still undiscovered beneath the water and the sediment and the sprawl. Together they paint a picture of a region that is not threatened by one fault, but is sitting on a distributed system of them, each storing strain, each capable of releasing it. Picture the Puget Lowland, then, not as a single fault line drawn on a map, but as a stretch of crust that has been wrinkled by compression, like a rug shoved against a wall, with the wrinkles running roughly parallel across the region. The Seattle Fault is one wrinkle, the Tacoma Fault to the south is another, the South Whidbey Island Fault to the north is a long one. Between and around them are smaller folds and strands, some mapped, some only suspected. This is the true shape of the hazard, a whole corrugated zone of crustal faults running through the most heavily populated part of the state, each one capable of storing and releasing strain, each one closer to some cities than to others. The famous offshore Megathrust is a single, enormous structure. The inland hazard is a family, distributed directly beneath the population, and because they are wrinkles in the same compressed sheet, driven by the same regional squeezing, they are not truly independent of one another. The folding that lifts one can load the next. The cities of the corridor, from Olympia and Tacoma in the south up through Seattle and Bellevue and on toward Everett, are not each menaced by their own private fault in isolation. They sit atop a connected system that has to release its accumulated strain somewhere, periodically, as the plates keep pressing. That systemic view is sobering, because it means the right question is not only when will the Seattle Fault break, but what is the whole network doing, and could more than one part of it move together? This is exactly why the new research about possible simultaneous ruptures is so important, and why I keep returning to it. If these faults were entirely independent, you could at least treat them one at a time, as separate risks with separate odds. But the suggestion that two Seattle area faults may have ruptured at about the same time in the past hints that they may be mechanically linked, that the breaking of one can load or trigger another. A network that can act together is far more dangerous than the same faults acting alone, because a linked rupture spreads the violent shaking across a wider area and sustains it for longer. The footprint of severe damage in a compound event could blanket not just Seattle but the broader metropolitan corridor, from Tacoma in the south through Seattle and up toward Everett all at once. It helps to understand why this particular patch of the continent is so riddled with faults in the first place, because it is not random. The Pacific Northwest is being squeezed. As the offshore Juan de Fuca plate dives under the continent, it does not simply slide cleanly away into the depths. It drags and pushes on the crust above it, and the geometry of the whole system causes the western edge of the continent to be compressed and rotated, like a slowly tightening vice. That compression has to be accommodated somewhere, and it is accommodated by the crust crumpling along a series of faults across the Puget Lowland. The Seattle Fault, the Tacoma Fault, the South Whidbey Island Fault, and the others are essentially wrinkles forming in the crust as the region is pressed. They are the inland consequence of the same plate tectonic engine that drives Cascadia offshore. In other words, the famous offshore threat and the quiet inland faults are not unrelated. They are two expressions of the same squeezing, one out at the plate boundary, one directly beneath the cities. That connection matters, because it means these faults are not dormant relics that happened to twitch once long ago. They are active features of a still operating system, being loaded right now by the relentless motion of the plates, the same way a vice keeps tightening as long as you keep turning the handle. The strain that broke the Seattle Fault in 923 did not appear from nowhere, and it did not stop accumulating after the fault released it. The plates kept moving, the vice kept tightening. Strain has been rebuilding on these faults every year since, silently, and it will keep rebuilding until the next release. This is the crucial difference between a fault and a scar. A scar is finished. A fault is a wound that keeps reopening, because the force that caused it never went away. And because these faults share a common driver, The question of whether they can influence one another stops being far-fetched. If the same regional squeezing loads all of them, and if they are physically near one another in the crust, then the rupture of one can change the stress on its neighbours, nudging them closer to or further from their own failure. That is the mechanism that could lie behind the evidence of two Seattle area faults rupturing at about the same time. Not a coincidence, but a conversation between faults, conducted in the language of stress transfer, on timescales we're only beginning to read. And here is the thread again, because it is easy to drift into a catalogue of fault names and lose the point. The reason this network matters is the same reason the Seattle fault matters. All of it lies shallow, and all of it lies directly beneath where people live, in that worst-case geometry, where the energy has nowhere to go but straight up into the cities. The famous Cascadia Megathrust is one enormous fault, far offshore, that everyone watches. The Puget Lowland is a whole quiet family of faults, directly underfoot, that almost no one outside the field has heard of. The contrast could not be sharper, and it is the contrast at the centre of this entire story. So let us make it concrete. Let us stop talking about faults in the abstract and ask the question that actually matters to the 3.5 million people living on top of this system. What precisely would happen to the modern city if the Seattle fault woke up tomorrow? Part 11. The modern city in the crosshairs. Geologists and emergency planners have not left the question of a modern Seattle fault earthquake to the imagination. There is a well-known scenario, modelled in detail, that asks exactly what would happen if a magnitude 6.5 struck on the Seattle fault directly beneath the city. They chose that magnitude deliberately, not the maximum 7.5, but the more frequent, more realistic 6.5, precisely because it is the version that is plausibly due on that 1,000-year clock. And even that more modest scenario is sobering, because it runs into everything we have built since the last time the fault moved. Consider what sits on top of this fault now that was not there in the year 923. Downtown Seattle, with its towers of glass and steel, a network of elevated and at-grade highways, bridges, including floating bridges across Lake Washington, that are engineering marvels but also vulnerable in ways a fixed span is not. The port, one of the busiest on the west coast, built largely on filled, liquefaction-prone ground. Hospitals, schools, water mains, gas lines, fibre and the electrical grid, all of it threaded across and through the same soft basin and the same fault trace. When that scenario 6.5 ruptures directly underneath, the shaking arrives with the close, sharp violence we have talked about, amplified by the basin, concentrated on structures that vary enormously in how well they would survive. The older, unreinforced masonry buildings, the brick structures from the early 20th century that exist in any old American city, are the most lethal in this scenario. They were built before anyone in this region knew the Seattle fault existed, before modern seismic codes, and they can fail catastrophically in exactly the kind of sharp, close shaking the fault delivers. Bridges and overpasses on vulnerable ground could be damaged or dropped, severing the routes that emergency vehicles need. Liquefaction along the waterfront and the industrial flats could cripple the port and rupture the pipelines that carry water and fuel. And because the fault is so close, the warning systems that might give a coastal town precious seconds before a distant Cascadia quake would offer almost nothing here. The shaking would begin essentially the instant the fault let go. The most dangerous feature of an urban earthquake is rarely the first shock alone. It is the cascade that follows, the way one failure triggers the next. The shaking ruptures gas lines, and the broken gas finds an ignition source, and fires begin across the city at the very moment the water mains have also broken, leaving firefighters without pressure to fight them. This is not hypothetical. It is the pattern that turned past urban earthquakes into firestorms, where more of the city burned in the aftermath than fell in the shaking itself. The roads that emergency crews would use are blocked by debris or dropped where bridges failed. Hospitals, if they are among the older or less reinforced structures, may be damaged at the exact moment the injured need them most. Communications go down. The modern city is a tightly woven web of interdependent systems: water, power, fuel, transport, communication, medicine, and a close, strong earthquake can cut many of those threads at once, so that the days after the shaking can be as dangerous as the shaking itself. Recovery from such an event is measured not in days but in weeks and months for the lifelines, and potentially years for the full rebuild, and the formal scenarios planners use put the potential casualties and economic losses for a major Seattle fault rupture into the range of a genuine national-scale disaster. These are not numbers chosen for shock value. They are the careful output of engineers and emergency managers asking, soberly, what happens when this specific fault breaks beneath this specific modern city? And they keep arriving at the same conclusion we have been building toward all night, that proximity turns a moderate earthquake into a maximal problem for the place sitting on top of it. Then there is the water again. A repeat of the 923 seafloor uplift would generate another tsunami inside Puget Sound, and this time it would be racing toward a shoreline crowded with development, ferries, waterfront infrastructure, and people with almost no time to react. The combination, violent close shaking, basin amplification, liquefaction of the built-up flats, damaged bridges and lifelines, and a near-instant local tsunami is why specialists treat even the moderate Seattle fault scenario as one of the more serious urban earthquake threats in the country. Not the largest in magnitude, the most concentrated in consequence. It is worth grounding this in something the region has actually felt in living memory, because it sharpens the contrast. In the winter of 2001, an earthquake of magnitude 6.8 struck beneath the Puget Sound area, an event many residents still remember. It cracked walls, damaged older buildings, and shook the region hard. But that earthquake, despite its respectable magnitude, was a different kind of event from the Seattle fault scenario, and the difference is instructive. It happened very far down, around 50 kilometers down, far below the surface, inside the descending slab rather than in the shallow crust. That depth is the reason a magnitude 6.8 did not produce a catastrophe. The energy had to climb tens of kilometers to reach the surface, spreading and weakening along the way, so what arrived at the city was strong but survivable. Now take that same general magnitude and move it from 50 kilometers down to roughly 12 kilometers down, and move it from far below the region to directly beneath downtown on the Seattle fault. You have removed almost all of the protective distance. The shaking that arrives at the surface is far more violent, concentrated and damaging, even though the magnitude on paper might look similar or even smaller. The region's recent experience, in other words, was a relatively gentle preview delivered from a safe depth. A Seattle fault rupture would be the opposite, a shallow blow delivered point blank. People who lived through the 2001 event and concluded that the area can shrug off a near 7 should understand that they experienced the lucky version, softened by depth. The Seattle fault offers no such mercy. Layer onto that the specific vulnerabilities of the modern city. Stretches of Seattle are built on filled ground and old tide flats, the liquefaction-prone zones we discussed, and that is also where much of the port, the stadiums, and the industrial core sit. The region has spent years and enormous sums replacing and retrofitting vulnerable structures precisely because planners know what a shallow local quake could do, but no city of this size is ever fully retrofitted, and older masonry buildings remain scattered throughout. Add the floating bridges, the elevated roadways, the single points of failure in water and fuel and power that a dense modern city depends on, and you have a system where a close, shallow, basin-amplified earthquake could sever many lifelines at once. The scenario planner's model is not a fantasy of doom. It is a careful accounting of how a real city would respond to a real plausible rupture on the fault beneath it. And this is the moment to say plainly what the whole night has been building toward. When we compare the famous offshore monster to the quiet fault under the city, we are not comparing which is bigger. Cascadia is bigger, full stop. We are comparing which is more dangerous to this particular city, and the uncomfortable answer is that the close, shallow, frequent fault directly beneath Seattle has a serious claim to that title. It is the one whose moderate, plausible, on-the-clock earthquake could do the most concentrated harm to the most people in the urban core, and it is the one the maps and the public conversation have spent decades looking past. Which brings us finally to the noise, because whenever a fault like this gets attention, a wave of misinformation, prediction and conspiracy rushes in right behind the facts, and separating the two is its own kind of survival skill. Part 12. The difference between forecasting and fortune-telling. The single most common thing people get wrong about earthquakes is the belief that someone somewhere can predict them. That if the experts really wanted to, they could tell you that a magnitude 7 will strike Seattle on a Tuesday 3 weeks from now. They cannot. No one can. And understanding why no one can is essential to understanding how to think about the Seattle fault honestly, without either dismissing it or panicking over it. There is a crucial distinction here between two words that sound similar but mean very different things: prediction and forecasting. A prediction, in the strict scientific sense, would be a specific statement of when, where, and how big. A magnitude 7 on the Seattle Fault within the next 2 weeks. That kind of prediction is, with current science, impossible. The processes far down in the crust that determine the exact moment a fault lets go are hidden from us and may be fundamentally chaotic, sensitive to conditions we cannot measure kilometers underground. Despite more than a century of trying, no one has ever found a reliable precursor, a signal that consistently appears before earthquakes and only before earthquakes. People have looked at animal behavior, at groundwater changes, at strange lights, at radon gas, at countless other candidates. Nothing has held up as a dependable alarm bell. Forecasting is the honest alternative, and it is what real earthquake science actually does. A forecast is a statement of probability over a long time window. It says something like, this fault has a certain % chance of producing a major earthquake in the next 50 years. It identifies which faults are loaded, which regions are primed, which areas should be building to higher standards and preparing harder. That is not fortune-telling. It is risk assessment, the same kind of math that underlies insurance and engineering. When you hear that the Seattle Fault produces a moderate earthquake roughly every 1,000 years, and that it has been about 1,100 years since the last one, that is a forecast, a statement about long-run odds, not a countdown clock ticking toward a specific date. This distinction matters enormously for how you carry this information, so let me connect it straight back to the thread. When I say the close fault under Seattle is the real threat, and that a moderate rupture is plausibly due on its recurrence clock, I am making a forecast, not a prediction. I am not telling you it will happen tomorrow, or this year, or in your lifetime with certainty. I am telling you that the long-run odds for this specific close fault are meaningfully real, that the consequences would be severe because of proximity and the basin, and that this is exactly the kind of risk a rational city and a rational person prepares for over the long haul. The danger of the word overdue is that it smuggles in the idea of a schedule. There is no schedule. There is only a loaded fault and a set of odds. The history of trying to predict earthquakes is, frankly, a history of disappointment, and it is worth knowing because it explains why scientists are so careful with their language. There was a famous, well-funded effort built around a stretch of fault in California that had produced moderate earthquakes at strikingly regular intervals, roughly every couple of decades for over a century. Researchers reasoned that if any fault on Earth could be predicted, it would be this one, and they instrumented it heavily and forecast that the next quake would arrive by a certain year. That year came and went, and went. The earthquake eventually arrived more than a decade later than the window predicted, on a fault chosen specifically because it seemed the most predictable in the world. If that one could not be pinned down, the lesson was sobering for the whole field. There is an even starker pair of examples from the other side of the Pacific. In one case, authorities, noticing a swarm of foreshocks and other signs, ordered an evacuation of a city shortly before a major earthquake struck and many lives were saved. It looked like a triumph, proof that prediction was possible. But the very next year, a different city with no such clear warning signs was struck by a catastrophic earthquake that killed an enormous number of people, with no useful prediction at all. The hard truth that emerged is that the apparent success was not a repeatable method. Some earthquakes are preceded by obvious foreshocks, and many are not, and there is no reliable way to know in advance which kind you are dealing with. A swarm of small quakes might be foreshocks to something larger, or it might be a swarm that simply fades away, and only hindsight tells you which. This is the central problem with foreshocks as a warning. Studies suggest that only a modest fraction of large earthquakes are preceded by recognizable foreshocks, and that most small quakes are not foreshocks to anything. So if the Seattle Fault produced a flurry of small tremors next week, no honest scientist could tell you whether it was the prelude to the big rupture or just noise. The signal that would constitute a real warning is, with current knowledge, indistinguishable in the moment from the constant background chatter of a seismically active region. That is not a failure of effort. It is a property of the system, which appears to be fundamentally chaotic at the scales that matter. People have searched for a reliable warning sign for as long as earthquakes have terrified us, and the catalogue of candidates is long and, in hindsight, a little poignant. Strange behaviour in animals before a quake. changes in the level or chemistry of well water, faint electrical signals in the ground, unusual cloud shapes, lights in the sky, subtle swelling or tilting of the land. Each of these has had its moment of hope, a case where it seemed to line up with a coming earthquake, and each has ultimately failed the only test that matters: consistency. A precursor that appears before some earthquakes but not others, or that appears just as often when no earthquake follows, is not a warning, it is a coincidence wearing a costume. After decades of careful study, no candidate has shown the reliable, specific, repeatable behaviour that a true alarm would require. This is not for lack of trying, and it is not because scientists are not clever enough. It increasingly appears to reflect something fundamental about how faults work. The exact moment of failure may depend on conditions so fine-grained, so far down, and so inaccessible that the system behaves chaotically at the scales we can observe, like trying to predict exactly which gust of wind will finally topple a leaning tree. We can say the tree is leaning, that it is under strain, that it will eventually fall. We cannot say it will be the gust at 3 o'clock on Thursday. The Seattle fault is the leaning tree. We know it leans, we know it will fall. The hour is hidden from us, probably permanently with current science. What science can do well is the opposite end of the timeline. After a large earthquake, seismologists can forecast aftershocks with real skill, stating the probability that a strong aftershock will follow in the coming hours and days, because aftershock behaviour follows well-established statistical patterns. That is genuine, useful forecasting. But notice that it only works after the main event has already happened. The thing everyone actually wants, a warning before the main shock, remains beyond reach. The most that modern technology offers in advance is earthquake early warning, which is a different thing entirely. It does not predict an earthquake. It detects one that has already started and races a warning ahead of the shaking at the speed of electronics. For a distant quake that can buy precious seconds. For a rupture directly beneath the city, where the shaking and the alert arrive almost together, even that thin margin nearly vanishes. It is worth being honest about why the fantasy of prediction is so seductive. We desperately want control. We want to believe that if the threat is real, then surely someone could warn us in time to act on a specific day. But faults do not work on human schedules or human reassurances, and pretending otherwise is not just wrong, it is dangerous, because it leads people to wait for a warning that will never come, instead of preparing for a risk that is always present. The most responsible thing anyone studying the Seattle fault can tell you is not when it will break. It is that it can break, that the odds are not trivial, and that the time to be ready is the long, quiet stretch before it does, not the 8 or 10 seconds of warning you might get when it finally does. But prediction is only the gentler half of the misinformation problem. The louder, stranger half is the world of conspiracy theories that attaches itself to every fault and every earthquake, and the Seattle fault is no exception. Some of those theories are worth addressing directly, not to give them credit, but because the truth is more interesting than the fantasy. Part 13. The theories that rush in. Whenever earthquakes are in the conversation, a particular set of alternative explanations reliably surfaces, and I want to walk through the main ones honestly, because the goal here has never been to mock anyone for asking questions. The goal is to follow the evidence. So let us take the big ones in turn and see what the science actually shows. The first is the idea that solar activity, sunspots, solar flares, geomagnetic storms, somehow triggers earthquakes. It is an appealing notion, because both the sun and the Earth's interior are powerful and a little mysterious, and it feels like they ought to be connected. But when you actually run the numbers, the connection collapses. The energy that arrives at the Earth from even a strong geomagnetic storm, and the way it couples into the solid ground, is many orders of magnitude too small to influence the colossal forces locked up in a fault that has been accumulating strain for 1,000 years. Researchers have looked hard for a statistical link between solar activity and earthquakes, and at most they find weak, ambiguous signals that do not hold up as a real mechanism. The strain that breaks the Seattle fault was put there by the slow grinding of the Earth's own plates over centuries, not by anything the sun did last week. When the sun is quiet and an earthquake happens anyway, as is usually the case, the simple version of the solar trigger idea simply fails the test. The second theory is that human technology, often a facility called HAARP, or weather modification programs, or secret experiments, is deliberately or accidentally causing earthquakes. Again, the honest answer comes down to energy. The amount of energy released in even a moderate earthquake dwarfs anything human beings can project into the crust by orders of magnitude that are difficult to even picture. We genuinely can induce small earthquakes in specific, well-documented ways, mostly by injecting large volumes of wastewater far underground near existing faults, as has happened in parts of the central United States. But that is a narrow, understood phenomenon tied to fluid pressure, not a hidden weapon, and it has nothing to do with the tectonic loading of the Seattle Fault. No antenna array, no weather program, no secret installation is winding up the Seattle Fault. The plates are doing that, as they have for millions of years. The third theory is the one I have the most sympathy for because it contains a grain of truth twisted into the wrong shape. It is the idea that the authorities know more than they are telling us, that the real danger is being covered up. And here is the honest, almost ironic truth. The gap between the official hazard maps and the actual danger under Seattle is real, as we discussed, but it is not a cover-up. It is the opposite of a cover-up. The hidden faults and the higher frequencies are being discovered and published openly in 2026 by scientists whose entire job is to refine those maps and make the danger more visible, not less. The system is not hiding the threat. The system is, slowly and publicly, catching up to it. The truth is not that someone is concealing the danger. It is that the danger was genuinely underestimated, and careful science is correcting that in plain view. Let me put some real numbers behind the energy argument, because it is the single most useful tool you have for evaluating these claims, and once you internalize it, you can debunk most of them yourself. A moderate earthquake releases an amount of energy that is genuinely difficult to comprehend, equivalent to a substantial nuclear arsenal going off all at once, far down in the crust. The strain stored in a fault before a major rupture has been accumulating, joule by joule, for hundreds or thousands of years of relentless plate motion. Now compare that to the things people propose as triggers. The energy that a geomagnetic storm couples into the solid ground is smaller by a staggering margin. Many orders of magnitude, a difference so large that there is no plausible way for it to be the deciding factor in whether a fault that is already loaded to the breaking point finally lets go. It is like proposing that a feather landing on a skyscraper is what made the building eventually fall. Even if you could detect some tiny statistical wiggle, the mechanism is simply not there at the scale required. The same arithmetic dismantles the technology theories. A facility broadcasting radio energy into the upper atmosphere operates at power levels that are, again, almost incomprehensibly tiny compared to the energy budget of a fault. You cannot wind up a structure storing the equivalent of thousands of years of tectonic strain with an antenna array, any more than you could shift a mountain by shouting at it. The one genuine way humans do cause earthquakes is far more mundane and far better documented, injecting very large volumes of wastewater far underground, mostly as a byproduct of certain energy extraction, which can raise fluid pressure within existing faults and lubricate them into slipping. This is real. It has measurably increased earthquake rates in specific regions where that injection happens at scale, and it is studied openly. But it is a local, understood, pressure-driven effect tied to specific industrial activity, and nothing of the kind is winding up the Seattle Fault. The fault under Seattle is loaded by plate tectonics, the largest and most patient force on the planet, and that is both more ordinary and more formidable than any of the alternatives. It is worth asking why these theories are so persistent, because understanding the pull of them is part of resisting them. I think the appeal comes down to a kind of comfort that the truth does not offer. A solar death ray, a secret antenna, a government conspiracy, all of these, as frightening as they sound, share one reassuring feature. They imply an agent, a cause that someone controls, and therefore a danger that could in principle be switched off, exposed, or stopped. The real explanation is in some ways harder to sit with, because it offers no villain and no off switch. The truth is that the ground beneath a beautiful, thriving city is being squeezed by the blind, patient, unstoppable motion of the planet's own plates, and that it will release that strain on a timetable no one controls and no one can fully predict. There is no one to blame and no one to appeal to. That is a more unsettling thing to accept than a conspiracy, and I suspect that is exactly why the conspiracies endure. They give the fear a face. But the discipline of this channel, and the honest path through a story like this, is to follow the evidence even when the evidence is less satisfying than the fantasy. And the evidence points every time to the ordinary and the tectonic, not the sun, not a machine, not a hidden hand, just a fault, doing what faults have done for as long as there have been continents, in a place that happens now to have a city on top of it. As for the idea of a cover-up, I want to treat it with genuine respect, because beneath it is a legitimate instinct, the suspicion that the official story understates the danger. And here is the fascinating twist, in a narrow sense that instinct is correct, but for the opposite reason people assume. The danger has indeed been understated, not by concealment, but by incomplete science, and the people correcting it are the very institutions a conspiracy theory would cast as the villains. The new research revealing hidden faults and higher frequencies is published in the open by scientists whose careers are built on finding exactly these things and feeding them into better maps. A cover-up hides danger. What is actually happening is the reverse. Danger that was genuinely unknown is being dragged into the light and quantified, so that codes and plans can respond to it. The system is not lying to you. It is updating in public, which is the least dramatic and most trustworthy thing an institution can do. Let me tie all of this back to the central thread, because the debunking is not a detour, it is part of the argument. Every one of these theories is, in a sense, a way of looking away from the real and less dramatic truth. The sun is not the threat. Secret technology is not the threat. A government conspiracy is not the threat. The threat is a perfectly ordinary, perfectly natural shallow fault, sitting in the worst possible place, directly under a major city, on a clock that has plausibly run out for its moderate event. That is less exotic than a solar death ray or a secret weapon, but it is far more real and far more deserving of your attention. And once you accept that the real threat is the ordinary fault under your feet, the only rational question left is the practical one. Given a danger that cannot be predicted but can be prepared for, what does it actually look like to live wisely on top of it? Part 14. How to live on top of a loaded fault. There is a strange psychological trap that comes with a threat like the Seattle fault. Because it cannot be predicted, and because it might not happen for decades or even longer, the human mind tends to file it away as not real, or at least not urgent. We are very good at fearing things that are immediate and visible, and very bad at preparing for things that are certain in the long run but invisible in the short run. The Seattle fault lives entirely in that second category, and so the rational response to it is not panic and it is not denial. It is something quieter and more durable, the steady habit of preparation. What does that actually mean in practice? It does not mean living in fear or refusing to enjoy one of the most beautiful regions on the continent. The Pacific Northwest is genuinely a wonderful place to live, and the point of understanding the fault is not to ruin that. It is to live there with open eyes. Preparation for an individual looks mundane and unglamorous, which is exactly why people skip it. It looks like securing tall furniture and water heaters to the walls so they cannot topple and crush or start fires. It looks like keeping a supply of water and food set aside, because after a major earthquake, the systems that deliver those things, the water mains and the supply trucks, may be down for days or longer, especially given the liquefaction risk to the city's lifelines that we talked about. It looks like knowing how to shut off your gas, having a plan for how your household will reconnect if a quake hits when you're scattered across the city, and keeping sturdy shoes and a flashlight where you can reach them in the dark. On the larger scale, preparation looks like the things a city does over decades, and this is where the science genuinely changes lives. Every building constructed or retrofitted to modern seismic codes is a building far more likely to stand through the close, sharp shaking the Seattle fault delivers. Every unreinforced masonry building identified and strengthened is lives saved in advance. Every bridge upgraded, every pipeline made more flexible, every emergency plan rehearsed, is the city quietly buying down its risk during the long, quiet years before the fault moves. This is the larger reason the new research matters so much. When scientists discover that the hidden faults rupture more often than the maps assumed, that finding flows into building codes and planning, and over time it makes the whole region more survivable. The science that frightens us is the same science that protects us. There is also a scale of preparation between the individual and the whole city, and it may be the most powerful one of all, the neighborhood and the community. In the long quiet years before a fault moves, the work that pays off is not only structural but social, the slow building of the kind of community that can take care of itself when outside help is delayed. Communities that map who among them is elderly or disabled or living alone, who has medical needs, who has tools or generators or first aid training, are communities that can organize themselves in the chaotic first hours rather than waiting helplessly. None of this requires special expertise. It requires only that people know one another before the emergency, rather than meeting for the first time in the rubble. This matters more here than it might elsewhere, precisely because of everything we have established about proximity and lifelines. In a close, shallow rupture that damages bridges and liquefies the ground beneath key roots, whole neighbourhoods could be cut off from outside responders for days. The water may not run, the roads may be impassable, and the people best positioned to pull a neighbour from a collapsed porch or share a few days of stored water are simply the people next door. There is something almost hopeful in recognising that the most sophisticated response to an ancient, indifferent fault turns out to be one of the oldest human arrangements there is, neighbours who know and look out for one another. There is one more element of preparation that often gets overlooked, and it is the human one. In the aftermath of a major earthquake, especially one that severs roads and communications, the people most likely to save you in the first hours are not distant emergency responders who cannot reach you across collapsed bridges and liquefied ground. They are your neighbours, communities that know each other, that have even a loose plan for checking on one another, consistently fare better in disasters than communities of strangers. There is something almost reassuring in that, in the middle of all this geology. The most advanced thing you can do to prepare for an ancient fault is also one of the oldest, simply knowing the people around you. There is a simple physical response that deserves a mention here, because it is the thing most likely to actually save you in the first violent seconds, and it runs against instinct. When the shaking starts, the impulse for many people is to run, often toward a doorway or out into the street. Both can be deadly. Most earthquake injuries come from being struck by falling objects, toppling furniture and debris, and running through a shaking, debris-filled space exposes you to exactly those hazards, while stepping outside puts you under facades, glass, and power lines that fail in the strongest shaking. The guidance that emergency planners have converged on worldwide is to drop to the ground, take cover under something sturdy like a solid table, and hold on to it until the shaking stops. It is undramatic, and it works, because it keeps your body low and shielded during the seconds when the air is full of moving objects. Knowing that in advance, so that your body does it automatically, is worth more in a Seattle fault rupture than almost anything else, because there will be no time to think. Beyond that single reflex, the preparation that matters is the kind you do on an ordinary afternoon when nothing is happening. It is the unglamorous work of imagining calmly a day when the water does not run, the power is out, the stores are closed, the roads are broken, and help cannot reach your neighbourhood for days, and then quietly arranging your life so that you and the people you love can get through that. Stored water, enough for several days at minimum, because the water system is among the most vulnerable lifelines in a liquefaction-prone city. Food that needs no refrigeration or cooking, a way to keep warm, a way to see in the dark, a way to handle medications and basic first aid. Copies of important documents. A plan for how a scattered family reconnects when phones may not work and bridges may be down. None of it is exciting. All of it is the difference between hardship and catastrophe on the day the fault finally moves. And there is a quiet dignity in doing this, which I think is worth naming, because the alternative responses, denial and dread, are both forms of giving up. Denial says the threat is not real, and so does nothing, and is caught completely unprepared. Dread says the threat is so overwhelming that nothing can be done, and so also does nothing, paralyzed. Preparation is the mature middle path, the one that takes the danger seriously precisely because it is real, and then refuses to be helpless in the face of it. It is the same posture in the end that the scientists studying the fault are taking. They cannot stop the earthquake, and they cannot tell you the day it will come, but they can map the danger, strengthen the buildings, and hand the city the knowledge it needs to survive. That is not fatalism, and it is not panic. It is the steady, unglamorous courage of getting ready for something you cannot prevent. It also helps to reframe the time we have, the long quiet stretch before the fault moves, as an opportunity rather than a source of dread. Every year the fault stays quiet is a year a city can use, a year to retrofit another vulnerable building, to upgrade another stretch of pipeline, to teach another generation what to do when the ground starts to move. The silence is not just the sound of danger being stored, it is also the window in which preparation is possible. A fault that broke tomorrow would catch us as we are. A fault that breaks 50 years from now meets a city that has had 50 more years to get ready if it chooses to use them. The threat and the preparation are running against each other on the same clock, and unlike the fault, we actually get to decide how fast our side moves. Let me bring this back to the thread one more time, because preparation is the practical expression of everything we have established tonight. The reason any of this matters, the reason it is worth securing the water heater and retrofitting the building and knowing the neighbours, is precisely that the threat is close, frequent, and real, not distant and rare. If the only danger were the offshore Cascadia monster, far away and millennial in its rhythm, you might be forgiven for a certain fatalism. But the Seattle fault is the firecracker in the room, the moderate quake plausibly due on a human timescale, directly underneath the city. That is exactly the kind of threat that preparation actually works against. The fault is patient. The smart response is to be patient and prepared right back. And that brings us to the last and largest question of all, the one underneath everything we have talked about tonight. Part 15. The Real Threat. So let us return to where we started, to the image I asked you to hold on to, and let us see it now with everything we have learned. A fault, running east to west, directly under the city, last awake more than 1,000 years ago. We began by asking why almost everyone in the Pacific Northwest has spent decades looking the wrong way, out to sea, at the famous offshore monster, while this quiet fault waited beneath their feet. And now you understand the answer, and you understand why the title of this video is not hyperbole, but a careful, defensible claim. Everyone is bracing for Cascadia, and they are right to take Cascadia seriously. It is the largest earthquake threat on the continent, a magnitude 9 waiting offshore, certain to come on a geological clock and certain to be a catastrophe for the coast when it does. Nothing tonight diminishes that. But Cascadia is the dynamite a mile down the road. For the city of Seattle itself, the more dangerous thing may be the firecracker in the room, the shallow Seattle fault directly underneath, where proximity does what magnitude alone cannot, where a soft sedimentary basin amplifies and prolongs the shaking, where a moderate magnitude 6.5 is plausibly due on a 1,000-year clock that has already run 1,100 years, and where brand new research keeps finding more faults, breaking more often than the official maps ever admitted. That is the real threat. Not the biggest, the closest, the most frequent, and the most overlooked. And here is the part that I think is genuinely worth sitting with, the thing that makes this more than a lesson in geology. The fault has done all of this before, in a single winter, 1,100 years ago, and it left us the receipts. It lifted Restoration Point 20 feet into the sky, where it still stands today. It sent a wave across Puget Sound and dropped a sheet of sand on the Seattle shore. It threw a forest into Lake Washington, where the trees still stand underwater, upright, in the dark, a drowned grove keeping silent time since the year 923. Every one of those scars is a message from the last time the ground beneath this city moved, and the message is simple. This is real. This has happened. This will happen again. We just do not get to know when. Let me draw the whole argument together one final time, cleanly, so you can carry it with you, because it is easy to lose in all the detail. The reasoning goes like this. The most famous earthquake threat in the Pacific Northwest, the offshore Cascadia Megathrust, is the largest in magnitude, but it ruptures far out at sea, and for the city of Seattle specifically, its violence is softened by distance. The Seattle fault, by contrast, is a shallow fault directly beneath the city, where there is no distance to soften anything, and where a soft sedimentary basin actively amplifies and prolongs the shaking. We know exactly what this fault can do, because it did it in the winter of 923, lifting shorelines 20 feet, drowning a forest, and sending a wave across the sound. The maximum version of that event is not statistically overdue. There is likely a long buffer before the next magnitude 7.5. But a smaller, still devastating magnitude 6.5 class earthquake recurs on this fault roughly every 1,000 years, and it has been about 1,100 years since the last major rupture, which places that more frequent event squarely within a plausible window, and brand new research keeps finding that the faults beneath Seattle are more numerous and break more often than the official hazard maps have admitted. Every link in that chain is sober, sourced, and defensible. Together they make the case that the real threat to Seattle is not the famous one offshore. It is the quiet one underneath. If there is one idea I want to survive everything else from tonight, it is the difference between the loudest threat and the most dangerous one. We are wired to fear the biggest number, the most famous name, the most cinematic catastrophe. The offshore 9 has all of those things, and so it gets all of the attention. The fault under the city has none of them, No record-breaking magnitude, no famous name, no dramatic coastline footage, and so it gets overlooked, even though for the people directly above it, it may be the more dangerous of the two. That pattern, the dangerous thing hiding behind the loud thing, is not unique to earthquakes. It is one of the most reliable ways that real risks slip past us, in geology and in life. We watch the spectacular threat on the horizon and never notice the quiet one beneath our feet. The fault does not announce itself, and that is precisely what makes it so easy to forget. There is no smoke, no rumble, no warning glow on the horizon. There is only the city, going about its days, and the patient accumulation of strain in the rock below, invisible and silent, exactly as it was through all the quiet centuries before the winter of 923. Silence, on a locked fault, is not the absence of danger. It is the sound of danger being stored. There is something almost vertiginous about that, when you really let it land. Right now, tonight, more than 3.5 million people are going about their lives on top of a fault that is storing strain in total silence, exactly as it did through all the quiet centuries before 923. The city above it is more crowded, more connected, and in some ways more fragile than any version of it that has ever existed. And the fault does not know any of that, and does not care. It will move when the accumulated stress finally exceeds the strength of the rock, on its own schedule, indifferent to ours. The only thing within our power is to decide, in the long quiet years we're given, whether we spend them looking out at the wrong ocean, or whether we finally turn around and pay attention to the ground we're standing on. Because the most dangerous threats are so often not the loudest or the largest. They are the patient ones, the quiet ones, the ones directly beneath our feet that we have simply chosen not to see,